Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. We are continuing looking at Lasker's first high-profile event, the Hauptturnier of the Breslau 1889 German Chess Federation Congress. In the previous video, we covered the first 5 rounds. In round number 6, which was unfortunately not recorded, Lasker won his game again, putting him up to the beautiful 5.5 out of 6 you see just below the camera. Recall that the overall objective for this group stage is to finish in the top 4 overall, which will guarantee participation in the final group for the overall master title. Now at this point, Lasker's participation in that final group is pretty much guaranteed. I haven't done any precise simulations, but I have a feeling that at this point he could probably lose the next 3 games and still have a very good chance of qualifying. But given the state of his competition, I don't think that's super likely. The situation for his opponent, Mr. Viktor Tietz, as you can see, is a little bit more precipitous. He definitely needs to have a couple more good results in order to qualify. Now, let's talk about Lasker's opponent, Mr. Tietz. In terms of competition history, he has none. This is his first high-profile event, just like Lasker, so we don't really have any data to draw from. And in fact, his competitive history as a whole is a little bit scant. In the description of this video, I will put 2 links, which will be the 2 pages of his obituary posted in the 1938 edition of the Viennese chess newspaper. You will see in there, if you can speak German or if you're able to use Google Translate well enough, that he was much more of an organizer. He organized a handful of large tournaments in the city of Carlsbad in the following century, but as Lasker did not participate in even those, they fall somewhat outside the scope of this discussion, and so I'd rather not spend too much time talking about them if I don't have to. So what we have at this stage, Lasker very likely to go through, and he's playing with very little pressure in this game. Tietz definitely has a lot to play for and will be trying to win this at all costs, so we have a very interesting dichotomy. Let's see what it does for the actual game. Viktor Tietz, with the white pieces, opens with e4. We have e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and now bishop to b5. Tietz opts for the Spanish game. Now it's interesting, in the previous game, the third move of white was a novelty, whereas in this game, this third move is possibly the most analyzed third move position, possibly in the history of all of chess. It's a very interesting comparison there. Now, despite being from Berlin, Lasker decides to go for a6 instead of a knight to f6, going for Morphy's defense. Bishop to a4, knights to f6, and now castles. Now here, Lasker eschews all of the more popular 5th move options, bishop to e7, knight captures e4, bishop c5, b5, all of those. He instead opts for the move d6. I've seen this move referred to as the double deferred Steinitz defense, as playing the move on move 3 is the regular Steinitz defense. I don't really think it's worthy of much of a name, because this just transposes into the closed defense, especially after Tietz's move of d3, bishop to e7. So we have the closed defense to the Ruy Lopez. Tietz decides to play the patient move h3, and now castles from Lasker. Now, here, Tietz decides to go for an exchange that I'm not usually a fan of, bishop captures on c6. The tournament book points out an improving move of c3, which was played very recently at the 1889 New York tournament between Dion Martinez and David Baird. But Tietz decides to go for this exchange on c6. Fair enough. It's not necessarily a bad move, it's just not one that I'm personally a big fan of. He continues with the move knight to c3, and now Lasker plays the move c5. He needs to re-establish control of the d4 square, to prevent Tietz from expanding in the center at all. Tietz decides to go away from that and instead plays towards the king side with knight to e2. And now we reach a position that hasn't been played very often. I did find one game that took place prior to this one, where the move c4 was played. This was part of an 1872 match between Samuel Mises and Johann Minkwitz. After white played knight to g3, the players traded on d3, and then Minkwitz played his knight back to e8. However, in this position, Lasker decides to play knight to e8 right away. And this move is a novelty. It is move 10, and the players are playing a unique position that has never before been repeated in a recorded master game. So, now that the players are playing on their own, let's see what comes up. Tietz decides to start with the move g4. I sense a little bit of Philidor inspiration from this move, pushing the pawn forward before playing the knight to g3, though this does allow a very direct response from Lasker. The tournament book here suggests the immediate knight to g3, and it suggests that if black plays the move f5, which is the move they'll be looking to play quite often, you can exchange everything on f5, and then at the end of the line, white has this move knight to h2. They argue that this rook is not good on f5. This is one possibility. The thing is, after g4, Lasker has access to the immediate h5, and this poses very concrete problems. This adds 2 attackers to this pawn here on g4, so this has to be dealt with in some way. Of course, you can't take it because then the bishop takes on h3 and black just starts attacking for free. So Tietz is forced to play the somewhat uncomfortable looking knight to h2, but Lasker is able to continue on the aggressive with bishop to h4. Now the idea is that if white continues with knight to g3, matters can be simplified starting with h captures on g4. If h captures on g4 is played, then black is able to trade here on g3, and you can even push this pawn here to c4. It doesn't really matter when black regains the sacrificed pawn because white's pawn structure is so awful that they might as well be down upon themselves. I would say that black is at worst equal in this position. And if knight captures on g4, this does seem to hold the pawn structure somewhat better. But now black is going to play g6. They have plans of playing knight to g7 and eventually this aforementioned f5 break. And it's clear that white's knights are kind of clumsy. And even though black is going to be opening up their king just as much, white's pieces are in no condition to be starting any sort of attack. So I would say that black would definitely have the better of this position. So the hoped for knight to g3 is not possible. So Tietz continues developing normally with bishop to e3, and now Lasker sits on the position with g6. Now this is a very uncomfortable position for white, as I hope the notes have shown. It's hard for him to find a good move, and so Tietz decides to just sit on the position with king to g2. One can probably forgive Tietz for not finding a useful move in this position, but unfortunately for him, Lasker does. g6 was prepared with the very concrete f5 in mind. Now again, Tietz's piece coordination is probably not one that would allow the kingside position to be opened up, so for the moment he tries to keep things closed with f3, but Lasker really forces matters by playing knight to f6. And now there are 4 attackers here on the g4 pawn, so things do have to be opened up unless Tietz wants to lose a pawn for nothing. So g captures on f5 and g captures on f5. Now the position is opened up and Tietz really has to work on solidifying his position as soon as possible. So bishop to f2, trying to evict this problem bishop from h4. Lasker tries to hold on to it with knight to h7, but after queen to e1 it is clear that this bishop does have to move. There's no way to assign more defenders to it. Now you could trade off the bishops here. Lasker prefers to keep his bishop pair with bishop back to e7. Fair enough. And now Tietz closes things off with h4. Lasker will continue attacking with king to h8. Of course he wants to open up the g-file. Tietz retreats his king to h1, and now it's Lasker's turn to solidify the pawn structure with f4. There are no more kingside pawn breaks available, so Tietz has no way to alleviate any of this pressure, and the diagonals are ominously pointed towards white's king. This doubled pawns over on the queen side mean absolutely nothing. Black is just leagues better in this position. So, what does Tietz do in order to not lose this game? He starts by playing rook to g1, very sensible move. Queen to e8 here from Lasker. He doesn't really need to worry about doubling up on this pawn. This is going to be a weak pawn for the entire game. Tietz does the same, queen to f1, and now bishop to e6 from Lasker. Now it's interesting, this is the first time in the previous 2 games that he's actually developed his bishop. He didn't move it at all in the first game we showed, and this is move 22, where he's finally moving this one. So good job, Lasker, developing his pieces. Very fundamentally sound player. Bishop to e1 from Tietz, trying to rearrange, and now queen to f7 from Lasker. This double attack on the a2 pawn isn't really worth worrying about just yet, and Tietz does correctly recognize that by playing the move rook to d1. A common motif in this position is that if the bishop ever takes on a2, then b3 will trap it, and there is no way to get this bishop out. If you see Lasker not taking this pawn over the next couple of moves, you can calculate for yourself that b3 in those situations always works out. So instead of that, Lasker decides to play rook to g8, countering any sort of pressure on the g-file that Tietz will be able to come up with. And Tietz tries to go for a little bit more with rook to d2. Eventually this knight will move and he will slide his own rook over to the g2 square and try to double up, but unfortunately for him, Lasker is just a little bit faster. Rook to g6, and now with only being 1 move away from doubling up, Tietz is somewhat coerced into trading on g6. So rook captures g6 and queen captures on g6. Now Tietz continues with his plan knight to g1, slightly better than moving it to c3 as you want the knights over on the king side to defend against the incoming attacks. Rook to g8 from Lasker. And now Tietz really has an important choice to make. With Lasker doubled up on the g-file, does he allow this pressure, or does he look for counterplay elsewhere? Now, you can probably tell the answer to that right away. Of course, Tietz moved his knight off of the e2 square in order to bring his rook over to the g2 square. The problem with this is that this is a mistake that gives Lasker a very tangible advantage. The tournament book recommends going with the more solid pawn to b3, which prevents any idea of playing bishop captures on a2 ever, though they note that the endgame should be winning for black anyways, as this h-pawn is very vulnerable, and black will simply have moves like knight to f8, eventually move this queen out of the way somewhere, play knight to g6, and this pawn is going to fall. So there's really a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation here for Tietz. From an objective standpoint, rook to g2 should be classified as a mistake, and what I would now like you to do is pause the video and see if you can find the sequence of moves that gives Lasker his tangible advantage. All right, 3, 2, and 1. Pretty much any queen move will lead to some sort of advantage as long as you don't blunder the queen, but the most puzzle-like solution, don't do that, is to play simply queen captures on g2. The idea is that we're going to trade everything here on g2, rook g2, king g2, and now black is able to play bishop captures on a2. This move was impossible for many moves, but the thing here is that b3 doesn't do anything, because now the bishop can go to b1 and simply pick up all of these pawns sitting on the light squares, not that one. Now note that in the previous positions, when Tietz had his rook here on d2 and there was a knight here on e2, the knight could simply play knight to c3 and trap the bishop anyways. But now all of these pawns are just sitting ducks and there's nothing for white to do about it. So Tietz really has to scramble to find some sort of defense. He settles on knight to e2, bishop to b1 from Lasker, and now knight to c1. Lasker simply takes his second pawn with bishop captures on c2, and now we see Tietz's plan of b3. Now this does, for the moment, imprison the bishop. There is no way for it to escape, though the problem is that it's not like any of white's pieces are that good either. But if there is a universe where Tietz is able to bring his king over and pick up this bishop in exchange for, let's say, 2 or 3 of his pawns, then we have a pretty unbalanced endgame that he could quite possibly hold. So it's Lasker's job to evacuate his bishop. He does so by playing the move knight to f8. Your king to f1 from Tietz, and now knight to e6. If this knight gets to d4, it will defend the bishop and there's nothing more to talk about. So Tietz stops this through playing bishop to f2, but now a5. This is another way to save the captive bishop. Your king to e2 and now a4, and this has to be dealt with. If you do nothing, then we're simply going to take this and the bishop is defended. If you push, then the bishop is going to be defended through this pawn. So Tietz decides to capture it, but now bishop captures on a4. The bishop has escaped. Black is simply up 2 pawns. There's nothing more to talk about. Tietz plays on for a few more moves just out of spite. We have knight to a2 and now knight back to f8. Knight to c3 attacking the bishop. The bishop drops back to d7. And after knight to d5, Lasker finally drops back his bishop to d8. And it was here on move 40 that Viktor Tietz resigned the game. It makes sense to resign at this point. Now he's down 2 pawns, and now the players have reached the time control, so they get more time. If there was any sort of time scramble going on at the end here, then it was reasonable to see why he would play on. But at this point, there is just absolutely nothing. I think it's safe to say that the turning point of this game came pretty early on. Here at move 11, Tietz went for the very uncoerced move g4, and after Lasker started to break open the king side, it was clear that Tietz did not have the coordination to deal with the opening of the king side quite like Lasker did. With that, our coverage of the group stage of the Breslau 1889 Hauptturnier is over, as rounds 8 and 9 were also not recorded. On screen, I will now post the final cross table for the event. We can see that Lasker very easily dominated this event with a score of 8 out of 9, and joining him in the top 4 and moving on to the final group are the 2 people that drew against him, Lorenzo Mabilis and Hans Sieger, as well as Adolf Rief coming in with a 5 out of 9 score, just good enough for 4th place. Sadly, neither Dr. Rief nor Mr. Tietz will move on with them. So, in the next video, we will be talking about the final group of this Hauptturnier. There will be much stronger opponents and more exciting games to look forward to. I hope to see you there, and until then.